Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more of the Great War, and we are on to week 213. Over by Christmas. Growing Allied confidence. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I'd love if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch, and please do go check out the gaming channel here on YouTube. Would love it if you... I already said all that. I was about to repeat myself. Ew. Gotta control the yap. All that out of the way. Let's just dive straight in.
You launch a series of stunningly successful offensives over a period of months, and yet, when they're over, you find yourself in a worse position than when you started. How can that be? Let's take a look.
Called being German. It's in the blood.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Battle of Amiens ended with a resounding Allied victory that really shook the Germans. This was a part of the new Allied strategy of launching small attacks all up and down the Western Front. Allied troops continued arriving in Vladivostok as well, even as Russia's Bolshevik government launched a terror campaign against its internal opponents. In the Caucasus, Baku managed to defend itself from the Ottomans.
Nice.
But disorder within Baku was growing and growing, and Lionel Dunsterville, in command of the small British force there, was pessimistic. He had been under the impression that he was bringing limited technical help to train the locals to defend themselves. The locals thought the British were coming to fight for them. He had just 3 battalions from the Midlands. Baku itself could be pretty easily defended from the west, where there were steep but not very high cliffs, and the gap of Wolf's Gate. Heck, 1 battalion was probably enough for that. But northwest of the city, the cliffs disappear into flatlands, and that's also where some of the main oil fields and refineries were located, as well as where the railway entered the town. So defensive lines were going to have to be stretched up there, and that's like a 25-kilometer front. It would be tricky, if it were at all possible, to defend the city from that direction. Further south, some other British were trying to fool the Ottomans. On August 20th, the British Imperial Camel Corps, having ridden all the way across the desert from Al-Mudawara in under 2 weeks, was now some 25 kilometers southeast of Amman. They learned that the Ottomans were in force between them and the Amman Railway, which they had come to sabotage. But even if they couldn't do that, they could still fool the enemy into thinking they were far more than they actually were all over the region. So each man opened 3 or 4 tins of bully beef, destroyed the contents, and littered the cans around. The cars they had with them drove around like crazy, leaving all sorts of crisscross tire tracks. They even took animal droppings that they burned as fuel and scattered that around to suggest a whole lot more camels. Then they headed out. By this time, Edmund Allenby's overall plan of deception ahead of his planned September offensive seemed to be working, if he could convince the Ottoman 8th Army under German Liman von Sanders that he...
I was about to say, is that an Ottoman general without the name Pasha? No, it was a German.
...would be attacking to the east of the Ottoman lines across the River Jordan as he had before. Sanders was in for a nasty surprise. The Germans were being repeatedly surprised on the Western Front, though, unable to gauge where the next Allied attack would come from. This week saw the Battle of the Ailette, conducted by Charles Mangin and the French 10th Army. It was a success, and after the French attacked between Soissons and Compiègne the 20th, German Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff will call this a second black day for the German army.
Awfully optimistic there, Ludendorff. Doing great.
The British Army launches the Battle of Alber, also called the Battle of Bapaume, the 21st. Here is Julian Byng and the 3rd Army using tanks to take the Alber-Arras Railway. Byng attacked with 13 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions, and 5 tank battalions numbering 156 tanks. Now, they attacked on a 20-kilometer front, which was pretty wide for that size force, but the Germans only had 10 divisions opposing them. The New Zealand Rifle Brigade spearheaded the attack the 21st, and by leapfrogging, as the British had at Amiens, by the end of the week, the front line was east of the Alber-Arras Railway, and they had taken 5,000 prisoners in just the first 2 days. On August 20th, with the French at the outskirts of Lassen, Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch is now confident enough that he writes French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and says they can secure victory in 1919. The French captured Lassen the 21st, That day, when the attack on the River Somme was resumed, British Commander Sir Douglas Haig said he thought they could win it by the end of the year. On the
Whoa. I get crazy here. Whoa.
Somme front, though, the Germans
By the end of 1918? No way.
still outnumbered the Allies 42 divisions
Next thing he'll be saying is he'll have it done by November 11th, 1918. The 11th hour.
to 32. But the Allies had momentum and morale. They began taking all of the scenes of the bloodiest fighting from 1916 as the week came to an end. But let's look at the overall German situation in the West. Now,
It's not good. There. Explained.
with a month of hindsight since their last Western Front offensives. The Germans, beginning in March, had put together the greatest string of tactical successes of the whole war, and yet they had not produced any great advantage, let alone strategic victory. In fact, it was the opposite. Germany in August 1918 was in a far weaker strategic position than it had been at the beginning of the year. It was now weaker in manpower and equipment than its opponents, and I mean both quantitatively and qualitatively, and morale was at a new low. And the reasons for the failure. In the German 1918 offensives, David Zabecki has quite a lot to say about that. On a strategic level, he thinks the offensives were doomed from the start in terms of achieving a military victory. They had only a slight numerical superiority, but their equipment was inferior and worn, and they had an inadequate supply system. They may, however, have been able to convince the Allies that Germany itself could not be defeated militarily, and entered into peace negotiations from a position of strength, but they did not do this. They could, Zabecki argues, with better operational design, have split the British from the French, and probably even driven the British off the continent. But then what? Britain was not going to abandon the fight as long as Germany held the Belgian coast. Britain and the Allies had naval superiority, and the blockade was strangling Germany. The Americans could have just been redirected to Britain for an eventual counterattack like, spoiler alert, what happened a couple decades later. Thing is,
Dude, don't spoil World War II yet. We haven't gotten there. Gosh. I was looking forward to that, but now I can't.
on the tactical level, the Germans were formidable opponents. Their discipline, training, leadership, and tactical doctrine produced units that were almost impossible to beat in anything approaching evenly matched force-to-force encounters, either on the defense or the offense. The German army's greatest tactical handicap was its mobility, which limited its ability to maneuver to operational depth. But even off the Western Front, looking at the total German picture, you saw other major problems. J.G. Meyer writes in A World Undone, farther to the east, the folly that had been Brest-Litovsk was continuing to draw German troops into a military, political, and economic quagmire. They had to occupy the city of Kharkov, deep inside Ukraine, to maintain some vestige of control and any hope of extracting grain. They had to move into the Donetsk basin in search of fuel for the decrepit railways taken from the Russians. They had to stretch their lines of communication into the Crimea to discourage an Allied advance from the Middle East. Things were looking grim for them all over.
I don't know exactly what they could have done differently there, though, in that situation. Like, if we really look at it, because let's say they left peacefully. They did not occupy those lands. They just, like, made them independent states with full fucking freedoms or whatever, right? They didn't try to put them under German control. Even if that were the case, then the Germans, and they had friendly relations with those now released nations, with even the people. Those nations themselves also wouldn't have been able to provide Germany with anything. Germany has to. This is a fucked up thing to say. Germany has to, in order for Germany to survive, has to take that grain from Ukraine. By Germany taking that grain from Ukraine, that means Ukrainians are not getting that necessary grain that they need because, well, they have just been put through war and lots of it, and they are struggling just as well, if not worse, because of they were where the fighting was, whereas the German homeland has not really seen any fighting. So yeah, in terms of looking at it from a German leadership perspective, I don't think there was really any other option for them. Perhaps I could see an argument being made that had Germany just completely left those places to their own whatever, right? Didn't try and control them to take their fuel and their grain and whatnot, and just left them to be independent sovereign states and just moved all of their forces from the east to the west. I could see an argument being made that through that added military might, that Germany perhaps could have forced something onto the Allies. But even then, that is as a general, and you're looking at the situation here, and especially this war that has dragged on far longer than anyone thought it would. Would you then make that decision of that gamble of let's not take the thing that could potentially help us last longer in this fight and just try and make another attempt for a quick victory like we did in 1914 and just move all the troops to the west? This is a part where I'm like, I think I probably, even with hindsight, the situation that the Germans are in probably would have made that same decision of Brest-Litovsk. Yeah. I think by this point the Germans are essentially in an impossible situation. They really don't have. They're kind of limited in their options as to what they could do. Now, of course, as we saw in the last couple weeks, Germans probably should have retreated to the Ludendorff line by now, the Hindenburg line, to shorten the front and better defend against the oncoming allies, and maybe even find a way to negotiate that. So by this time, Ludendorff may be so stuck up his own ass that not want to negotiate peace. But yeah, essentially, I think the Germans are kind of fucked. By 1918, I don't think the Germans really had much options. Just look with what I can see and what I understand of all this. I don't think the Germans really have much tactical options available to them, especially when it came to the east there.
Over. On the 22nd, the Allies announced their aims with the landings at Archangel. Those forces were called in by the legitimate representative of the Merman government to expel the Germans and annul Brest-Litovsk. They guarantee no interference in internal Russian affairs. That's interesting, because this week, after secret negotiations between the Soviets and Germans, the Soviets recognize an independent Georgian state. This is part of the German machinations to secure Baku and its oil. But this causes anti-German sentiment to grow in the Turkish press. And as for the Soviets, this week saw them again lose Irkutsk to the Czechoslovak Legion. And that brings us to the end of a rather confusing week of an almost impossibly confusing war.
Yeah.
A ruse by the Imperial Camel Corps on the Palestine front, defense issues in the Caucasus, Allied successes on the Western Front, an overall depressing situation for the Germans, but specifically tactical success, but overall failure for them on the Western Front. But the Germans' single greatest flaw, according to Zabecki, and if you read his monumental work on the German 1918 offensives, there's not a whole lot of reason to dispute him, was the lack of clearly defined strategic and operational objectives. Even post-war, Ludendorff and Chief of Staff...
Again, that is something that I think we see a lot with the failures here throughout World War I, especially Haig's failures, is the lack of those definitive objectives. It is what ends up screwing these people over.
Staff Paul von Hindenburg in their writings still don't have any clear vision of a concrete military objective this year, or a concrete political one. What Ludendorff was doing this summer, and this he did admit in his writing, was keeping the initiative, keeping the attacks going in the hope of exploiting whatever opportunities came up. Well, American General Gordon Sullivan once said, "Hope is not a method." But as Zabecki points out, hope was the only method German high command had left in the summer of 1918.
Yeah.
If you'd like to get David Zabecki's book about the Germans,
And that was Over by Christmas, Growing Allied Confidence, the Great War, Week 213. It's interesting here to see how at the start of the German Spring Offensive of 1918, I remember saying something along the lines of, it's hard to see how the Germans lose this. That a couple weeks later, it's like, I can see how the Germans lost that pretty easily. Right? With the context that happen that you of course get through hindsight and stuff like that. This was a good week. I think he did a good job of explaining the kind of confusion that is happening within this week here of the war. I have nothing to add here at the end. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.